A few years ago, I taught a year-long class at one of my local quilt shops. And the way this class worked was the students signed up for the whole year. It was a mystery project every month. So they would show up, I would have the project planned, they would get to go do a little shopping at the quilt shop, and then once they had their supplies, we would reconvene and we would make the project. And this was a lot of fun. We did a lot of different projects over the course of that year. It was called the Coriander Quilt Club, and it was a lot of fun. We had a great group of ladies that came every month. One of the projects that we did one month was a Scrappy project. And I remember this one lady in that class. She was very good at all of the things. We did applique, we did paper piecing, I taught hand quilting, machine quilting, all sorts of different quilty techniques. But the month we did the Scrappy project, this lady walked into class, I showed what the project was and said it was going to be Scrappy, and her face dropped and she said, "I can't make a Scrappy quilt." She was just totally befuddled about how to go about putting scrap fabrics together and didn't know where to start. And I've quickly come to realize that there are a lot of people who feel that same way, that scrap quilts, choosing those fabrics, or even just grabbing different fabrics from your scrap bins can feel very overwhelming. When I announced that we were going to be doing a Scrappy Irish chain, the questions started rolling in the comments. Can you show us how to do scrap fabrics? How do we choose fabrics? And so I thought I would take a fair amount of time in this video and kind of go over how to choose fabrics for a scrap quilt. So if you have ever felt overwhelmed, or maybe you've made a scrap quilt that you haven't been happy with, just stick around and we'll see if we can take some of the guesswork out of making a scrappy quilt. First of all, I want to start off by saying I don't think that there are right or wrong ways to go about making a scrap quilt. Some people are just pulling out all of the bits and bobs they have left in their scrap bin and they are just putting it all together. It's Christmas fabrics and Halloween fabrics and maybe patriotic fabrics and all of the things into one quilt. And if that makes you happy and you love mixing all things together, you should go ahead and do that. And when we think back to how scrap quilts might have been made many, many years ago, they could have been made using leftover bits of clothing, just mixing all of those usable pieces of cloth together into a functional quilt. So the way we approach scrap quilting today might look like that, or it might look a little bit different. When I make scrap quilts, I tend to have more of a planned, scrappy approach. And so that's going to be what I'm talking about here today. If you're watching this video and you have felt unsure about making a scrap quilt, I think you might fit into one of three categories. Number one, you've never made a scrap quilt and you're just super overwhelmed with how to even go about choosing so many different fabrics. What if they don't fit together? What if the colors aren't right? Are there guidelines that I need to work within to make the perfect scrap quilt? Maybe that's you. Number two, you have seen scrappy quilts that you thought were not that cute and you're afraid that could happen. Or number three, maybe you've started making a scrappy quilt and it just hasn't turned out how you wanted it to. You got partway in and you just weren't quite happy with what your choices were. If you fall into any of those categories, you may be the same way that I am in that you like to have a little bit more of a planned approach to your scrappy quilt. And as you can see behind me, I have made my fair share of scrappy quilts. In fact, when I started quilt making, I was primarily making scrappy quilts. I've been making quilts for probably 25 years or so. And when I first started making quilts, there were not the lines of fabric like there are now. So we were picking and choosing from what was in quilt shops and mixing and matching different fabrics together. And I really enjoy that. I think it's a lot of fun. But there are different things that I do when I make a scrap quilt. So I'm going to go over just some things to kind of tuck in your mind when you are looking at your fabrics. And then I'm going to talk specifically parameters that I set up for myself when I was making each of these different quilts here. And I will talk about the fabrics, kind of the guidelines that I set, and maybe that will give you some ideas about how you could approach making a scrap quilt. One more thing before I dive into that, I had mentioned Scrappy Irish chain. Maybe you haven't seen my previous videos to know what I'm talking about, but we are going to be doing kind of a scrap along on this Scrappy Irish chain quilt. It's a super scrappy quilt that uses 2.5-inch print squares. And this was the quilt I was referencing when I started getting questions about choosing scrap fabrics. This is a free pattern. I'm going to link to it in the description box below this video, so if you want to grab it, or if you haven't already, it's going to be there. There are a couple cutting adjustments that I made to the original pattern. It's not one of my patterns, and I noticed that there were some things that needed updated, and one of the things was pointed out by one of you, so thank you very much for bringing that to my attention. So I'm going to have those updates listed in the description box below. I've mentioned them previously, but I do want to make sure that you're aware of that in case you missed that information before. So this is the quilt that brought on this scrappy fabric video today. Okay, moving ahead. Number one, the first thing to think about in regards to choosing fabrics is, are they warm fabrics or are they cool toned fabrics? Now you might do this naturally, and in fact these first 2 points that I'm going to make, if you have been a quilt maker for any length of time, you're probably going to notice that your existing stash fabrics fall into certain categories. So when you look behind me, I use a lot of warm colors, and my fabric lines that I create are also mostly warm colors. And you'll notice that when I make scrap quilts, a lot of those fabrics are warm in color. So just something to kind of tuck in your mind that you might start noticing about the fabrics you tend to gravitate towards. The second thing, notice the tone of the fabrics and also the genre of the fabrics. And I think these 2 points go hand in hand. A lot of more traditional fabrics tend to have a muddier, browner sort of background, whereas some of the newer fabrics, newer isn't the right word, less traditional, more modern type fabrics tend to have a cleaner white type of background. Think about if you were going to be making a painting and you are grabbing a red paint color. Now you're going to paint that red color on a sheet of brown cardstock, and you're going to paint that red color on a sheet of white cardstock. You can clearly picture in your mind that those 2 reds, even though that red is the same color initially, are going to show up very differently depending on the background that it's printed on. And that's what I mean when I talk about a browner background or a whiter background. I want you to look down here on my cutting table. This is a neat book. I pulled some books earlier when I was preparing for this video, some scrapbooks that I could reference. And this is Oh Scrap by Lisa Alexander. And it's a really neat scrapbook. And Lisa mixes together a lot of different fabric lines, fabric designers. And if you're looking for just a fun scrappy book, this is a great one that I could recommend. But I pulled this one because there were 2 quilts I wanted to show you here. Okay, right here. Let me budge this over a little bit. So I want you to look at these 2 quilts right here. The colors in each of them are primarily the same colors. We see the reds, we have the reds over here, we have yellows, blues, but you can see the difference in the browner tones as opposed to the whiter tones. Even though we're working with similar colors, they feel completely different because this is a more traditional quilt and this is a more modern quilt, and the colors reflect that. So keep that in mind. And here is where I said that you're probably going to see that if you have a stash of fabrics of any kind, you probably tend to have more of this sort of fabric or more of this sort of fabric. And you're probably already naturally gravitating towards more traditional or less traditional fabrics as well as palettes. And I pulled out just a selection of fabrics here too to kind of illustrate that point. So this is my sun-washed line of fabric. And this is kind of the colors and prints that I designed for this collection. And it feels completely different from this little assortment of fabrics that I pulled together because they're just completely different in genre and in tone. And while these fabrics work beautifully together with each other, they wouldn't mix as well with these fabrics on this side. And I have some of the blocks here that I was working on, so you can see it's scrappy, but it's a much more traditional palette and traditional prints. The other thing that I wanted to mention in regard to these specific fabrics, and really any time that you are choosing fabrics for a scrap quilt, is if you can shop in store at a local quilt shop, it is going to make choosing fabrics so much easier because you can make your little stacks of bolts and see how they play together, pull some out, put some other ones in, and it makes things a lot easier for choosing fabrics. Oh, let's slide this over. And then I have just 2 more points that are good to keep in mind. The third point is scale of your prints. Oftentimes when we're making scrap quilts, we are using smaller pieces of fabric. And so if you have large scale prints, you can certainly use those within your quilt, but be aware that when you're cutting them down into smaller pieces, you could be chopping your prints up. So if you have big flowers, you're gonna have just little bits of big flowers. So I tend to use smaller scale prints for scrap quilts, but you certainly don't need to do that. And then the final point is sometimes you might want to ground your quilt fabrics with a nice neutral. If I step to the side here, you're going to see that I use a lot of gray in my scrap quilts, all the way over to this far quilt here. And I just like the way gray kind of ties everything together. It gives my eyes a little bit of a resting spot. And I mentioned that I tend to use a lot of warm colors. I also use warm grays. So all of the grays that I've used in these quilts are the warm shades of gray. And if we take a look back at this Scrappy Irish chain one more time, I am going to be using gray as I'm making this quilt as well, just as in this sample quilt. Those are the points that you can just kind of tuck in your mind. A lot of those you're going to tend to do naturally, but maybe the scale, and then thinking about grounding everything together with a neutral color. Let me show you this too. This is the actual pattern cover for this quilt. And here they've used kind of a cool pinky color that sort of acts as their neutral. It doesn't have to be a gray or a black or a brown or some of those colors we typically think of as neutrals. It can be something with a little bit more color. I've even heard people say, Joanna at a Fig Tree says that yellow is a color that she likes to use for a neutral. And I've heard people say red. You've probably seen scrappy quilts that use red as an accent color. Some people will view red as kind of that neutral color that they're adding to their scrap quilt. So it can definitely be a color that is tying everything together. All right, so let's set up some parameters for making scrappy quilts, because that is usually what I'm thinking. So I've tucked all of those first 4 points in my head, but then I am working within specific guidelines that I've set for myself. For example, for the Scrappy Irish chain quilt, I am going to be using all fabrics from my fabric lines. That is one way that you can approach a scrappy quilt. Use fabrics all from one fabric designer. You've probably noticed you have a favorite or maybe a couple favorites, and if you choose all fabrics from their lines, they're in general going to jive pretty nicely with each other. For me, I tend not to pull in seasonal lines from those designers. So if I am using all of my fabric lines, I would tend not to pull in Hollyberry, which was one of my Christmas lines. There would be some prints that I would pull in, and then Cozy Up, which was one of my autumn themed lines. I would not tend to use as many of those prints either. So you might just keep that in mind if you are choosing all of one designer's fabric lines, but you can throw those in too if you want to. Like I said, I don't think there's a right or a wrong way. It is whatever makes your heart sing. And if you just enjoy that quilt and enjoy all of those fabrics, I think it's great to stick them in there if you want to. So this quilt here in the middle, we're gonna pull this down and I'm gonna show this to you up close, but this quilt was my Moda Blockheads quilt, one of them. I made several Scrappy ones and it uses all of my fabric lines. So I'm gonna pull this down and we're gonna take a look at this up close. And here she is up close. So all of the fabrics in this quilt are from various of my fabric lines. I've used a nice amount of gray, both the light gray in the alternating blocks as well as bits of the darker gray. I want to pull it up here because this little block is so cute. I love this little one right here. So you can see it's just a lot of color. They are warm shades of colors and gives you an idea of how it might look to mix together fabrics from one designer. Just keep going here a little bit further. I think some of these are so pretty. I really like the Moda Blockheads quilt-alongs because it does allow me to make these really fun scrap quilts. Just sort of picking and choosing fabrics as I go. Now, another way that we could make a scrap quilt would be to choose fabrics from a few designers. So I might choose some of my fabrics, and then I really like mixing in Vanessa Gertzen of Lella Boutique. I like mixing Fig Tree with my fabrics. I like mixing Sherry and Chelsea with my fabrics. So I might choose some of those designers that mix really well with my fabric lines and throw those all together into a quilt. I wanted to mention a really neat resource that Moda has over on their website. I'm going to link to it down below, but for each fabric line, they put it into a category. They have classic, they have metro, they have style, Christmas, and basics, I think are the 5. There might be a 6th one in there, but in the link, if you go there, you're going to see all of the fabric lines listed, and then you will see the name of the category that they put the fabrics within. And you are going to notice that different fabrics are listed the same as other fabrics. So I mentioned that I like mixing with Fig Tree, with Sherry and Chelsea, with Vanessa Gertzen. Our fabrics are typically listed under the style category, and I like mixing all of those together. And then if you start looking at some of the more traditional fabric designers for Moda, maybe Betsy Chuchin or Primitive Gatherings, Kansas Troubles, their fabric lines tend to be lumped under the same category. So sometimes that's really helpful to take a look at those categories and see how Moda has labeled them to see exactly the genre of those fabrics. So I'm going to link to that below so that you have access to that information. Now, I was saying about mixing and matching Moda designers. This basket quilt is one. I guess they don't have to be Moda designers either. They could be just mixing and matching just a few designers. This basket quilt is one where I mixed mine with Fig Tree and Vanessa Gertzen. So I'll pull that one down. We'll take a look at that one. And oh, I have some over on my ladder that aren't right behind me. So I'm gonna pull those over too, and we will take a look at some of those up close. This is the Happy Scrappy Baskets quilt. And for this one, I used those 3 different designers I mentioned. Myself, these are some of my fabrics. This one, this one, this one, and Fig Tree. This is a Fig Tree, Fig Tree, Fig Tree. And then I also used Lella Boutique. This purple is Lella Boutique. This little guy over here. Let's see, where else are some of hers? These little polka dots are hers. And mix them all together. I have used a fair amount of a nice warm gray here for the base of those baskets. And these color palettes, they're all mostly warm shades, just really mixed together very nicely. Now, the next 2 quilts I'm going to show you are also examples of mixing together Moda designers, but they can also fall into my 3rd category, which is use a limited color palette. That is another way that you might approach a scrappy quilt. So let's peel this back here. This red and white quilt is from the book Sherry McConnell and I published together called Sunday Best Quilts, and it is a super scrappy red and white, low volume and red quilt. And this one uses a number of different Moda Fabrics designers. I've used Fig Tree. I have, who else do I have in here? Sherry and Chelsea. I have Sweetwater. The name was escaping me. All I could think of was Hometown, which is the name of one of their lines. Sweetwater does the beautiful little text fabrics. Boy, I don't know who else I have in here. Just a wide variety of different designers in here. But one thing I did pay attention to was the tones of my reds that I used. And I also used mostly cream backgrounds for these different prints. Now, if you look at these reds, these are Bonnie and Camille reds, you're going to see that they are a lot brighter and less warm in comparison to these other reds. So you can see what a difference paying attention to the warmth of your fabrics can make. Linen and Berries from Sunday Best Quilts. And we're just gonna roll into another quilt. Now I have a disclaimer on this next one. I don't have a pattern out for it. It was a quilt I made, a pattern I wrote, but the pattern is not available to purchase. So I almost didn't show it because I don't want people to be disappointed that the pattern's not available. It probably will be available at some point. It's just not available right now. But it was such a nice example of a scrap quilt that I hated not to include it because I think it gives us a lot of good tips for choosing fabrics. So just know there's not a pattern available for this next one. It's this little fella here. And for this one, I chose a bunch of blacks and grays and then some warm beiges. Now I did use some of these cooler slate grays in this quilt because the palette was pretty limited and I wanted there to be a little bit more contrast. So these are the fabrics. I'm just gonna lay them out here so you can kind of see how they work together. These are the fabrics that I chose, and this is a prime example of how helpful it is to be able to visit your local quilt shop to choose fabrics, because I purchased all of these with the exception of this print, which I had in my stash already. Yes, and it's up here too. I had it in a couple colors. Oh, and we've got a black one over here too. But everything else was from one of my local quilt shops. And so I was able to mix and match, lay bolts out, stack them up, see how they played together. I could make sure that I had roughly the same number of prints within each of these different colorways here. I have about 6 of each of them. There's one color here. This one's just off camera. I don't have this one pictured in my little stack. So there's roughly 6 of each of these prints. And so I could just make sure that everything was really nice and balanced because I could shop at my local quilt shop. Now I know that not all of you have a local quilt shop that you can visit as easily as I can. One tip I have for that is if you purchase mini charm packs, if you know you have designers that you like or a fabric line you spot really catches your eye, if you purchase a mini charm, there's not a lot of investment in a mini charm and it allows you to see all of the fabrics within that line and you can really see the colors. Your computer monitor is going to vary in color, and so what you see on your screen might not be exactly what the fabric is going to look like once you have it right in front of you. So purchasing just the little mini charms gives you a great sampling of all of those fabrics in the line. Plus, at 2.5 inches square, they often work really nicely into a scrap quilt project. So this is another example of a limited palette. These are all Moda designers, but you can see it's a wider variety of Moda designers in this limited palette. Now, I do have, we're gonna leave that go for just a minute. Behind me here, I have a couple other limited palette quilts. This one to the far side, this one here I'll pull down, and then this quilt. I'm gonna pull down those 3. Those are all a big variety of designers, but I've kept the palette smaller, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about those prints too. I wanna pull those down. This quilt is from the very first book I wrote called Playful Petals. It's a book on applique, and this one is not quite as scrappy as some of the others, but all of my print fabrics are from different designers. Let me see if I can move this up a little bit here for you. Different designers, and you'll notice these are also 2-color prints. So I stuck with a warm palette, greens, there's yellows, here's some yellows, and then the aquas, and a little bit of gray, a lighter gray, and then I've got, let me get you over here, a darker gray in here as well. And different designers, same palette, everything warm, and kind of tied everything together with this peachy polka dot fabric. So definitely not as scrappy as some of the others, but in regard to the number of fabrics and designers, it would be a scrappier quilt. Pulling this one away. This is a Pinwheel sampler quilt. I'll have to look and see if this pattern is available. This was a quilt along, but I bet it happened in, I don't know, 2008, 2009. So it's been a little while, but I'll see if it's still available and link it if it is. It might not be. It would be an easy one to duplicate because you would just choose 12-inch blocks that have pinwheel sort of design. Let me move some of these up here so you can see we're just different pinwheels. Now, most of these fabrics are from the designer Sandy Henderson. She no longer designs fabric, but then to her fabrics, I added some other designers. So this is an Erin McMorris print. This is Amy Butler. Let's see what else I recognize in here. A lot of it is Sandy Henderson. These are Sandy. All of these are, this is Denise Schmidt up here. So mostly Sandy Henderson, but then I added in those other fabrics here and there. So that is a way that you can combine a designer with a few others. Pick a designer that you like, use predominantly their fabrics, but then throw in a little bit other interesting fabrics here and there. And then this last one, this quilt is another one from my Playful Petals book. And for this one, I just went with a red and aqua palette. But I was very specific about my shades. You'll see these are those warm reds again, and the same aqua throughout. There are a lot of different shades of aqua when you start looking. And in my opinion, well, the way I like to mix them is to kind of stay within that same color family. Sometimes I like to mix different colors too, but this is an example of staying within the same color family. And then a warm gray as my neutral. So those are kind of mixed palettes, mixing designers, limited palettes. But say you want to throw all the colors in, because sometimes you just want to throw all the colors in. The last quilts, these last 3 that I have to share here are ones where I threw all the colors in. Now, I did still stick with mostly warm colors, and we're gonna take a look at those up close because I think they're a lot of fun. Let me pull those down. This first quilt that I have to show you is a spool quilt that I designed for Fat Quarter Shop as part of one of their So Colorful monthly fabric clubs that they offer on their website. This was one of the first years that they offered the So Colorful monthly fabric pack, and I designed this spool quilt for that. So the way I chose these fabrics is I started with whatever the fabrics were in their monthly pack, and then I pulled out my favorites and then added some of my fabrics to mix in with their pack of fabrics. So each month you get a different color. They still have this ongoing club, so I'll link to that below if that's something that sounds like fun. It's a great way to add to your stash by color. Every month is a different color, and you get a Fat Quarter pack of that color that you can add to your stash, make a project, do with whatever you want. So you can see I pulled out a lot of the warmer colors in each pack. Let me move this orange one over, and then added some of my own fabrics to each of those. Pull this down. So that is this quilt. This is a linen, mochi polka dot linen that was produced by Moda. I think they still have that available. I'll have to look and see because that's a fun one to use. And then we get up to the yellows and the blues. So a lot of different fabrics, a lot of different colors, and just a really fun scrap quilt. Okay, let's move down to this next one. So this next quilt is from my book, Playful Petals. I did a lot of scrap quilts in that book. So an orange peel design, a wrinkly orange peel design. But for this one, I used a lot of the colors. They're the warm shades, not a lot of primary colors in there. And then I used the light gray, warm gray to kind of offset everything. The prints are mostly small. I used some larger florals here and there, but just a real happy, sherbety, scrappy quilt. And then this last one is kind of the bright version of the fabrics you just saw. So still like sherbety colors, but they are bright sherbety colors. And I'm gonna move this up so you can see the whole block. This is fun because this is the block right here. This block, 2 solids, 2 half square triangles, 2 solids, 2 half square triangles. It just repeats, solids, half square triangles, just that little 4 patch to make this entire block. Here we have the 2 solid squares, the half square triangles, solid squares, half square triangles. So it looks more complex when you're looking at that block, but it is really just this little 4 patch unit repeating throughout the quilt. I do have the measurements listed in a quick blog post, so I will make sure and link to that below. This was a quilt that I send out scraps from my stash to members in a quilting bee that I was in, and then they made blocks for me. So these were all my stash fabrics, but the blocks are all made by different people, which makes it a really neat quilt. So I'll slide it up here. There's another one. I was a little bit laughing to myself as I was pulling some of these quilts because I thought this little chat today about stash fabric quilts could also be called quilts that Corey still needs to bind, because I think at least half of them, maybe more of them, are not bound. These older quilts that I've had, when I start pulling them out, are oftentimes the ones that still need to be bound. So I thought that was kind of funny as I started pulling those out. But okay, back to this quilt here. You can see scrappy, happy, colorful goodness. Mostly warms, and then a nice crisp white to just set those colorful colors off. And that is the last quilt that I have to share with you here today. So let's wrap up a little bit. Pay attention to scale, maybe a neutral color to ground everything, genre of fabrics, tone of fabrics. Do I like working with warmer fabrics or cool fabrics? And then set some guidelines to work within. Choose fabrics maybe from just one designer, choose fabrics from 2 or 3 designers, or maybe choose a limited color palette. Those are all really easy ways to set yourself up for a scrap quilt success. If you have any questions about anything I've talked about, I feel like I've covered a lot of things, and it's all very much, you know, this is how I approach it. Maybe you approach it differently, or something didn't quite make sense. And as I said at the very beginning, I don't think there's any right or wrong way to approach making a scrap quilt. You want to end up with a quilt that you love and that you enjoyed making. That is the goal. And if we hit that goal, then we are doing great. So leave me any questions or comments you might have, and I'll catch you again next time.